In just 39 seconds, one of Britain's most respected actresses would be reduced to calling a daytime television host an absolute disgrace before storming off the Loose Women's set in what can only be described as the most explosive confrontation in the show's history. What began as Dame Helen Mirren's appearance to promote her latest project quickly descended into a verbal battleground that left the studio audience gasping and the production team scrambling to cut to commercial break. The tension was palpable from the moment Helen Mirren walked onto the Loose Women set last night. Ruth Langsford, seated in her usual position of authority, greeted the Oscar-winning actress with what appeared to be a warm smile, but those who know Ruth's interviewing style could sense something brewing beneath the surface. Helen, elegant as always in a navy blazer and pearls, took her seat with the grace of someone who has navigated decades of press appearances, completely unaware that she was about to face one of the most hostile interviews of her career. "Dame Helen, lovely to have you here," Ruth began, her voice carrying that familiar saccharine tone that regular viewers know often precedes trouble. "I have to say, I'm quite fascinated by some of your recent comments about the royal family, particularly your views on the monarchy's relevance in modern Britain." Helen's eyebrows raised slightly, a subtle indication that she hadn't expected to dive straight into controversial territory. "Well, Ruth, I think the monarchy serves an important constitutional role, though I understand not everyone shares that view," she replied diplomatically, clearly trying to steer the conversation towards safer ground. But Ruth wasn't having it. Leaning forward with predatory intensity, she pressed on. "That's interesting, because in your interview with The Guardian last month, you seemed to suggest that perhaps it was time for Britain to evolve beyond hereditary privilege. Those were your words, weren't they?" The camera captured Helen's slight shift in her chair, the first sign that Ruth's aggressive approach was making the seasoned actress uncomfortable. "I think you might be taking that quote out of context, Ruth. What I actually said was that all institutions should be open to thoughtful discussion about their role in society." "Oh, I have the full quote right here," Ruth interrupted, producing a printed article from beneath her desk with theatrical flair. "You said, and I quote, 'While I have great respect for the Queen personally, I do wonder if future generations might question whether hereditary privilege has a place in a truly democratic society.' That sounds pretty clear to me." The other panelists, Nadia Sawalha, Kay Adams, and Linda Robson, exchanged uncomfortable glances. This wasn't the usual light-hearted celebrity chat they'd expected. Helen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but her voice remained controlled. "Yes, I did say that, and I stand by it as a legitimate question that many people are asking. Questioning institutions doesn't mean attacking them, Ruth." Ruth's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Well, Dame Helen, I have to say I find it rather rich that someone who's built a career playing the Queen profiting from the monarchy, one might say, is now questioning its very existence. Isn't that a bit hypocritical?" The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Helen's composure cracked just slightly, her voice taking on an edge. "I beg your pardon? Are you suggesting that portraying historical figures somehow compromises my right to have opinions about contemporary society?" "I'm suggesting that it's convenient to bite the hand that feeds you after it's made you millions." Ruth shot back, her smile never wavering but her eyes growing colder by the second. "You've won awards, earned critical acclaim, and built a significant portion of your reputation on playing Elizabeth II. And now you're questioning whether the monarchy should exist at all?" Helen's face flushed slightly, the first visible sign that Ruth's attacks were hitting their mark. "That's an absolutely ridiculous assertion, Ruth. My portrayal of the Queen was done with enormous respect and admiration for her as a person. That doesn't mean I can't engage in broader discussions about the role of constitutional monarchy in the 21st century. "Broader discussions," Ruth repeated mockingly. "Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like someone who's happy to take the money and accolades when it suits them, but then turn around and undermine the very institution that made them famous." The tension in the studio was becoming unbearable. Nadia Sawalha attempted to interject with a diplomatic comment about different perspectives being valuable, but Ruth silenced her with a sharp look that could have cut glass. Linda Robson shifted nervously in her seat, clearly wishing she were anywhere else. The audience, initially excited to see Helen Mirren, was now sitting in stunned silence as they witnessed what felt more like an ambush than an interview. Helen took a deep breath, clearly fighting to maintain her professionalism in the face of Ruth's relentless assault. "Ruth, I think you're deliberately mischaracterizing my position. Having nuanced views about complex social and political issues isn't hypocrisy, it's called being a thinking person." "A thinking person?" Ruth's voice dripped with condescension. "Well, this thinking person is wondering why you waited until after you'd milked every possible opportunity from your royal portrayals before suddenly discovering your Republican conscience. The timing seems rather convenient, doesn't it?" That was the moment Helen Mirren's famous composure finally began to crack. Her voice, still controlled but now carrying a dangerous undertone, cut through Ruth's smugness like a knife. "I think you need to be very careful about your implications, Ruth." But Ruth Langsford was just getting started, and the look in her eyes suggested she had no intention of backing down. What happened next would push one of Britain's most distinguished actresses beyond her breaking point. Ruth's voice dropped to a more intimate, conspiratorial tone, the kind she reserved for her most devastating attacks. "You know what I find particularly interesting, Helen? Your timing. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't it just 2 years ago that you were practically gushing about the royal family at the BAFTAs? Something about them being the embodiment of British excellence, if I recall correctly." Helen's eyes flashed dangerously. "That was a completely different context, and you know it. I was speaking about—" "Oh no, let me finish," Ruth interrupted with a raised hand, her smile now resembling that of a shark sensing blood in the water. "Because I did my research, Helen. I have the footage right here if you'd like to watch it. You were practically curtsying through your acceptance speech, weren't you? All that talk about honor and tradition and serving the crown. The production team behind the cameras was frantically trying to signal to Ruth to dial it back, but she was completely ignoring them. This wasn't television anymore, this was a public execution. And Ruth Langsford was the executioner." Helen's voice became dangerously quiet. "Ruth, what exactly are you trying to achieve here?" "I'm trying to understand how someone can be so two-faced," Ruth replied with mock innocence. "One minute you're collecting your damehood from Prince William, looking absolutely delighted, I might add, and the next you're suggesting the whole system should be dismantled. Do you not see how that looks to ordinary people?" The accusation of being two-faced hit Helen like a physical blow. Her hands, which had been resting calmly in her lap, now gripped the arms of her chair. "Two-faced? How dare you?" "How dare I what?" Ruth's voice rose sharply, abandoning any pretense of civility. "Point out the obvious? You can't have it both ways, Helen. You can't collect the honors, accept the titles, bank the checks from all those royal films, and then turn around and suggest maybe the monarchy shouldn't exist. That's called having your cake and eating it too." The audience was now completely silent, transfixed by the brutal spectacle unfolding before them. Several people in the front row looked visibly uncomfortable, some even averting their eyes as if they were witnessing a car crash. Nadia Sawalha made another attempt to intervene, but Helen held up her hand. "No, Nadia, let me respond to this." Helen's voice was steady now, but there was fire in her eyes that hadn't been there before. "Ruth, I don't know what's driven you to conduct what can only be described as an ambush interview, but I won't sit here and be lectured about integrity by someone who clearly doesn't understand the difference between respecting individuals and questioning systems." Ruth leaned back in her chair, clearly enjoying the fact that she'd finally gotten under Helen's skin. "Oh, I understand perfectly. What I don't understand is how you can look at yourself in the mirror." That was the line that shouldn't have been crossed. The studio fell completely silent except for the low hum of the cameras. Helen Mirren, Dame of the British Empire, Oscar winner, and one of the most respected actresses of her generation, stared at Ruth Langsford with an expression that could have frozen hell itself. "Excuse me?" Helen's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried more menace than if she'd been shouting. Ruth, either oblivious to the danger or simply too drunk on her own power to care, pressed on. "I said, I don't understand how you can look at yourself in the mirror, taking everything the establishment has to offer and then stabbing it in the back. It's frankly disgusting behavior." The word disgusting seemed to echo in the studio like a gunshot. Helen's face went through a series of expressions: shock, disbelief, and then something that the cameras captured in perfect, devastating clarity: pure rage. "You're calling me disgusting?" Helen's voice was no longer quiet. For the first time in the interview, she raised her voice, and the power behind it was formidable. You sit there, conducting what amounts to a character assassination on national television, putting words in my mouth, twisting my statements, and you have the unmitigated gall to call me disgusting? Ruth's confidence wavered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered. I'm calling your behavior disgusting, yes. The behavior of someone who… No. Helen's voice cut through Ruth's like a sword. You don't get to hide behind semantics now. You've made this personal, Ruth. You've attacked my integrity, my character, and my right to have complex thoughts about complex issues. And why? Because it makes for good television? Because you think it'll get you ratings? The other panelists were now openly staring at Ruth with expressions of horror and disbelief. Even Kay Adams, usually Ruth's most loyal supporter, looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. Linda Robson had actually turned her chair slightly away from the confrontation, as if physical distance might somehow protect her from the fallout. Ruth's face was flushed now, her carefully applied makeup beginning to show stress marks around her eyes. But she wasn't backing down. This has nothing to do with ratings, Helen. This has to do with holding people accountable for their contradictions. My contradictions? Helen laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. Let me tell you about contradictions, Ruth. The contradiction of a television presenter who built her career on the back of daytime television, an industry that exists purely for entertainment, lecturing an actress about the ethics of her profession. The contradiction of someone who makes a living from celebrity gossip and manufactured drama pointing fingers at others about authenticity. Ruth's mouth fell open slightly. She clearly hadn't expected Helen to fight back with such precision and fury. That's not… I don't… Oh, you don't? What? Helen was in full flow now, her years of stage experience lending power to every word. You don't make your living from exploiting celebrity culture? You don't profit from the very system of fame and privilege that you're now attacking me for being part of. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, Ruth. Absolutely breathtaking. The confrontation had now completely spiraled beyond anything anyone in the studio had ever witnessed. Ruth Langsford, for the first time in her presenting career, looked genuinely rattled, but instead of backing down gracefully, she made the fatal mistake of doubling down. At least I'm honest about what I do, she snapped. I don't pretend to be some great intellectual while cashing checks from the very institutions I claim to question. That was the moment Helen Mirren finally reached her breaking point. And what happened next would become legendary in television history. Helen stood up so abruptly that her chair rolled backward, the wheels squeaking against the studio floor in the sudden silence. Her face was a mask of controlled fury, and when she spoke, her voice carried the full weight of her theatrical training and decades of commanding stages and film sets around the world. How fucking dare you, she said, the profanity hitting the studio like a thunderbolt. The audience gasped collectively, several people covering their mouths in shock. How dare you sit there and lecture me about honesty when you've spent the last 15 minutes conducting what amounts to a hatchet job disguised as journalism? Ruth's face went pale, but she wasn't done yet. Helen, there's no need for that language. Oh, there's every need. Helen's voice was now projecting to the back of the studio, commanding attention like she was delivering Hamlet's soliloquy. You want to talk about honesty, Ruth? Let's talk about the honesty of ambushing a guest with deliberately twisted interpretations of their words. Let's talk about the honesty of turning what should have been a professional interview into a personal attack designed to humiliate and embarrass. The production team behind the cameras was in complete chaos. Producers were frantically whispering into their headsets, trying to decide whether to cut to commercial or let this historic meltdown play out. The director, clearly out of his depth, kept the cameras rolling. This was television gold, even if it was career-ending gold. Ruth, perhaps realizing she had pushed too far, attempted to regain control. Helen, please sit down. We can discuss this civilly. Civilly? Helen's laugh was harsh and bitter. You lost the right to talk about civility the moment you started questioning my ability to look at myself in the mirror. You want to know what I see when I look in the mirror, Ruth? I see someone who has spent 60 years in this business maintaining their dignity and professionalism, even when dealing with small-minded people who mistake cruelty for journalism. The other panelists were frozen in their seats, unsure whether to flee or stay and witness what was rapidly becoming the most explosive moment in loose women history. Nadia Savalha looked like she might cry. while Kay Adams appeared to be seriously considering whether she could somehow disappear entirely. But Helen wasn't finished. She took a step toward Ruth's desk, and her voice dropped to a dangerous whisper that somehow carried more menace than if she'd been screaming. You know what the real tragedy is here, Ruth? You had one of the most respected actresses of my generation sitting right there, ready to have an intelligent conversation about art, politics, and society. Instead, you chose to play the role of a tabloid hack, more interested in creating drama than fostering genuine dialogue. Ruth's carefully constructed presenter persona was completely shattered now. Her voice cracked slightly as she tried to respond. I was just trying to ask legitimate questions. Legitimate questions? Helen's voice rose again, and this time there was no mistaking the contempt in it. Legitimate questions don't involve twisting someone's words, taking quotes out of context, and making personal attacks on their character. What you did wasn't journalism, Ruth. It was character assassination, pure and simple. The audience was completely transfixed. Some were recording on their phones, despite the studio's no-phone policy, knowing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for years. Others sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they were seeing. Helen began gathering her things, her handbag, her coat, her dignity with movements that were precise and deliberate. I've spent decades dealing with difficult interviews, hostile journalists, and challenging questions. But I've never encountered such unprofessional, mean-spirited behavior masquerading as legitimate television. Ruth made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Helen, please, don't leave like this. We can start over. Helen turned to face Ruth one final time, and her expression was one of complete disdain. Start over? With you? I wouldn't give you the satisfaction. She paused, looking directly into the main camera. To anyone watching at home, I want you to know that what you've witnessed here today is not journalism. It's not entertainment. It's bullying, pure and simple. Then, she turned back to Ruth and delivered the line that would be replayed on every news program and social media platform for weeks to come. And you, Ruth Langsford, are an absolute disgrace to the profession of broadcasting. You should be ashamed of yourself, but I suspect you're incapable of that level of self-reflection. With that, Helen Mirren walked toward the studio exit with all the dignity of someone leaving a royal premiere. The camera followed her progress across the set, capturing every step of what would become one of the most famous exits in television history. Ruth, left alone at her desk, with the other panelists staring at her in horror, attempted to regain some semblance of control. Well, that was unexpected, she said weakly, but her voice was shaking, and her usual confidence had completely evaporated. The studio audience began to murmur among themselves, the sound growing louder as Helen reached the exit. Just before she left, she turned back one final time and addressed the audience directly. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that your evening out has been spoiled by this display of unprofessionalism. You deserved better, and I'm sorry you didn't get it. And with that, Dame Helen Mirren walked out of the Loose Women studio, leaving behind a stunned silence, a shattered presenter, and what would undoubtedly become the most talked-about interview disaster in British television history. The cameras kept rolling for several more seconds, capturing Ruth's face as the full magnitude of what had just happened began to sink in. The show cut to commercial break 30 seconds later, but the damage was already done. In less than 20 minutes, Ruth Langsford had managed to turn what should have been a routine celebrity interview into a career-defining disaster, while Helen Mirren had reminded everyone exactly why she was considered one of Britain's most formidable actresses both on screen and off.